Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. It's been a little while since I last uploaded a tutorial with voiceover here on YouTube. I know most of my videos do tend to be time lapses set to music, but one of my big goals for this year is to share more chatty voiceover style tutorials with you all. I do think it's a great way to connect and share more tips, techniques and insights and just generally personal experiences as I work. So hopefully I'll be able to put more of those out for you guys this year. So in today's video, I'm excited to share with you my latest drawing, which I finally completed after starting it back in December. It's a beautiful great green macaw and I honestly really enjoyed drawing those beautiful colourful feathers, and let's be honest, I think it's the perfect antidote to January's dreary vibes. Do you not agree? A burst of colour feels like just what we need right now. So without further ado, let's dive into today's tutorial. And as always, if you're looking for the full length version, this one's about 10 hours long. You can find it over on my Patreon. For this YouTube version, I'll be sharing a condensed time-lapse version with plenty of insights, tips and tricks sprinkled throughout. So grab a comfy spot and let's get started on today's tutorial. So just like usual, and this applies to pretty much all of my drawings, I always start with the eye, and this step is so important to get right from the outset. If the eye isn't correct, then the overall character and expression of the bird can feel just off for the entire drawing. So the good news is if something does go wrong, it's easy enough to start over. So that is why I always start with the eye. So I begin by outlining the eye with a black polychromate pencil to create a bit of a border around the eyeball. A sharp pencil is absolutely key for this step. Accuracy and precision are everything, especially when it comes to the fine details like the ring around the eye. So once I have the key shape in place, I will then move on to adding colour around the eye, working carefully on the shadows and the highlights to give it that realistic 3D appearance. So for the eyeball itself, I always use a firm pressure with black to make it as deep and rich in colour as possible. Bird eyes are really quite striking, so I do want them to stand out against the highlights, so getting that depth is pretty crucial. From there, I'd start working outwards from the eye, focusing on that white fleshy texture of the face. So at first glance the face might seem white, but if you look closely you'll notice it's full of subtle colours and textures. In my drawing I cover all of the white of the paper with layers of colour to build up those fleshy textures, basically the bumpy areas with the tiny hills and valleys. I'm not exactly sure of the technical name for this texture. So when drawing anything white with colour pencil, I always emphasise the shadows. For this piece I added blue tones under the head feathers, some pink near the beak and warm greys for the brighter areas. I used a mix of scribbling techniques and varying pressure to emulate that uneven fleshy texture. I kind of added a mixture of small circles and wavy lines with both blunt and sharp pencils, just to bring out a variety of textures. So since the drawing is fairly small, I didn't stress too much about including every single detail. Instead, my focus was on creating the impression of detail, which just works really beautifully for a piece like this. So next I turned my attention to the red feathers above the beak. I started with a basic base layer of red, just simply covering the white of the paper, and then from there I introduced some darker tones using a couple of deeper reds, and if I remember correctly, a Caput Mortuum Violet for those really dark red shadows. My goal here was to create a fluffy texture rather than crisp, defined lines, so I stuck with a slightly blunt pencil for the shadow work, and this helps to soften those transitions and gives the feathers that soft, natural look. So to bring out the sunlight side of the red feathers, I added a touch of yellow-orange to the left side, creating a little bit of a subtle warm glow. And then finally I flicked a bit of black out to the left to suggest those darker shapes and shadows, which just adds a little bit of depth and definition to the feathers. So now let's take a look at some of those beautiful green feathers. These are completely different in process and appearance compared to the feathers on the body. They do have a softer, fluffier look, but there is still a bit of a sense of form and structure to them that I really wanted to capture. Now I know this might sound a little bit unconventional, but one of my favourite techniques is to start with the details first and then build up the values and colours on top. I know it's not the traditional way, and some artists will be screaming at me right now because a lot of artists do leave the details until last, but hey-ho, art is subjective, and this is the method that works really well for me. So when I say I start with the details, I don't mean literally diving into every tiny feature right away. I begin by blocking out the basic clumps of feathers and adding detail to those blocks as I go along. This approach allows me to establish the structure of the feathers early on, which then serves as a bit of a guide for the rest of the process. Once the structure was in place, I moved on to shading with my chosen green pencils. There's a mixture of greens here, everything from earthy, warm greens to bright, vibrant greens, and even cooler minty shades. So using the initial detail structure as a guide, I carefully layered each of those greens, slightly overlapping them to create that smooth transition. And at this stage I wasn't too concerned about the detail. My main focus was covering the white of the paper and then laying down those green tones. So I started with a light layer to plan out the placement of the colours, and then gradually increase the pressure to add more depth, just deepen the colour and saturate those greens. So once the greens were in place, I shifted my attention to amplifying the shadows. I made sure that the most prominent shadows were really dark and saturated enough by using I think it was permanent green olive or permanent olive green to pull out the depth. For the absolute deepest corners, I went in with a tiny touch of black just to give it a little bit of an extra pop. So from the green feathers, I then moved on to the beak, and this was pretty much straightforward to work on. I really wanted to capture that scratchy textured look that parrot beaks often have, and to do that I added a few scraggly irregular lines using browns, black and dark sepia. Some were sharp and some were a little bit more blunt. From there I wanted to bring out the highlights and those rough details, so I used a few quick swipes of my electric eraser with a nice fine tip. Honestly, it was a pretty simple process, but those little touches made all the difference in getting that realistic worn type look. So now moving on to the most time consuming part of the whole drawing. This definitely took some time. Sometimes when I'm working on a drawing, I do like to build up the layers across the entire body all at once. Other times I like to zone in and work through the process on a smaller scale. And this drawing was definitely one of those moments. So for something like this, with so many little parts to the puzzle, all those different shapes, sizes and colour transitions, it can feel a little bit overwhelming. So to make it a little bit more manageable, and honestly it's more relaxing and rewarding, I decided to break it down, and this way it gives you a little bit more of a sense of accomplishment much earlier, which is such a boost to keep going. So take the feather shoulders for example. These shapes are pretty large and clunky, so I focused on them one at a time. It's almost like tackling mini drawings within the bigger piece. I know some people wonder how I judge the values when I work this way. The answer is basically all about comparing as I go along. I constantly check the colours and the values side by side to make it look cohesive, and then once I've covered everything, I do a final value assessment right at the end and make those necessary adjustments. It is a bit of an ongoing process, but it really works, and I demonstrate and explain exactly how I do this in the full 10-hour tutorial on Patreon. Now here in the shoulder feathers, we're starting to see some gorgeous autumnal and golden tones coming through. This is where the light really hits on the bird, and I wanted those colours to feel really vibrant but also warm, kind of like a summer golden glow. So to achieve this, I worked slowly and lightly, building up those layers to keep the feathers looking smooth and soft. I started with some green ochre and olive yellow from the Luminance range of pencils, and gently overlapped each layer to create those soft transitions. So once I had that base in place, I gradually introduced some spring green and some walnut brown to either enhance the green tones or deepen the shadows. And then for a little extra pop, I added a touch of burnt sienna, which is this beautiful burnt browny orange sort of colour. I brought those into the shadows of the yellows, and this really helped amplify the golden warmth in those shadowed areas. So let's slow things down a little for the next feather, and I'll take a closer look at how I layered everything step by step. So I started with a really light base layer of olive yellow. This is the Luminance pencil. I wanted to cover the entire shape with colour to begin with. I applied a really light layer at first and then repeated my layer to build up and saturate even more colour onto the base. Next, I focused on the most prominent colours that I could see from my reference. The bright pop of green at the tip immediately caught my eye, so I added a little bit of leaf green there. And then to blend it upwards into the feather, I brought in some spring green, overlapping the leaf green and gradually lightening the pressure as I moved up into that yellow base layer. The second colour that stood out to me was the rich brown tones in the centre of the feather. So starting with a super light pressure, I carefully mapped out where the brown should go, layering walnut brown over the yellow. I used a really soft touch around the edge of the brown just to keep that transition really smooth and natural. And then finally I went back in with my base colour, which is olive yellow, and applied it with a slightly firmer pressure across the whole feather. This really brought all the colours together, making them look vivid and rich. So to finish things off, I then added a touch of burnt sienna over the brown areas just to warm them up and give the feather a little extra glow. So from here it's pretty much just repeating the same process across the remaining feathers, using the same variety of colours to keep everything cohesive and vibrant. One thing I always aim to do is keep my pencil really sharp. It really does make a huge difference when we're filling in the grooves of the paper with the pigment of the pencil. It helps to keep the paper super smooth and eliminate that paper grain. So if you're curious about the sharpener that I use, I highly recommend the Swordfish sharpener. There are a few different types out there, and I'll pop a link to the exact one in the description box below so you can check that out. Now this puffed out section on the top of the feathers was relatively straightforward to work on. To capture the depth of the shadows, especially those really dark areas, I focused on making them extra rich and deep. I layered browns, dark sepia and black, just applying a little extra pressure to really push those shadows back. This contrast is what really helps those highlighted feathers to stand out and appear even brighter. So it's just all about a balance between the darks and the lights. Alright, so for this next part, the feathers here are completely different to the larger, more splayed feathers that we've just been working on. These feathers are much flatter with less depth, so I decided to tackle them as a group rather than working on each feather individually. Honestly, this approach made things so much quicker, and there was a lot less pencil switching, which is always a bonus. This method also makes it easier to judge your values as you go. When you're working on the whole group together like this, you can spot straight away if a colour needs to be darker or if an area needs more contrast. You can tweak things as you build up the layers basically, instead of having to go back later and recheck everything, which does save a ton of time. So to get started, I darkened my initial line drawing. Since I'd be glazing over the area with a base layer of colour, I wanted to make sure that those lines stayed visible underneath, a little bit like little guidelines to help me keep on track. So next I lightly glazed or shaded a base layer of colour over the entire patch of feathers. And then I did something a little unconventional. I used my electric eraser to pull out the light edges of each feather shape. Now, I wasn't drawing the highlights in just yet. This was more of a no colour here zone kind of marker to remind myself where to leave the lighter areas as I built up those layers. So I know it's a little bit of a quirky method, but it really does work for me. After that, I marked out the most prominent shapes and shadows that I could see. There were a few deeper shadows scattered throughout, so I plotted those in as little markers. Those two were kind of like creating a road map, so I wouldn't get lost in the big patch of feathers. So with all that prep done, the rest of the process was so much easier. I could just focus on building up the greens and layering a mix of tones from everything from the earthy green to the brighter, more vibrant shades. Just to build up that depth and dimension. So for this strip of feathers, I started out pretty much the same as before, plotting the main base colours and pinpointing the most prominent shapes. But because these feathers are larger in size, I did decide to tackle them one by one and adjust the colours as I went along. And as I worked, those feathers started to appear much more in the light, so I really wanted to make sure that they had that lovely bright sunlit look. So I added a little bit of leaf green, that's the polychromase leaf green, and I layered it with a firm pressure of the luminance spring green, and I found that those two colours worked really beautifully together to give them more of a vibrant natural glow. So I think it really brought the green to life. The rest of the feathers followed a very similar process with just a few adjustments to the colours as I worked my way across. Starting from the left hand side, you can see some gorgeous blues and turquoises really beginning to emerge here. So to capture those, I started with a light cobalt turquoise and a dark indigo for the deeper bluer shades, and then I brought in some bluish turquoise for those really rich vivid blues. They were just so satisfying to draw, just so rich and luscious. The feathers towards the bottom of the drawing, the ones which are closest to the eye, they're also the largest shapes in the whole piece, and because of their size and their prominence, it was really important for me to maintain that really smooth texture. I didn't want anything to look messy down here, especially because parrot feathers do have a silky smooth appearance, and I really wanted to replicate that in my drawing. So this meant taking my time with soft, light layers, keeping my pencil super sharp, and just gently overlapping the colours to create those seamless transitions. So as I worked my way across, those stunning turquoise tones really started to appear, and surprisingly I only used one turquoise pencil, which was the light phthalo green, but I blended it with other colours that I'd used to create some really beautiful variations of turquoise. So by adding just a touch of chrome green or light cobalt turquoise with a light hand, I could subtly shift the tone of the turquoise, and the results were really lovely. I also mixed in some bright greens like the spring green and the leaf green, and it really gave those colours a fresh summery vibe, and it just felt so cheerful and vibrant. So this final segment was all about contrast, balancing the muted dull down colours in the shadows with those light cheerful colours in the highlights. I really wanted to emphasise the contrast to give the drawing more depth and realism, so recognising where those shadows are and using more subdued tones, it really does make a difference when it comes to creating that sense of depth. My trusty dark sepia pencil came to the rescue for dulling down those greens in the deep shadows. It's such a handy pencil for muting colours without completely losing the underlying tone. And as I moved towards the brighter area on the right, I started to reintroduce some blues and turquoises, and then gradually it's just increasing the pressure a little bit there to really bring out the richness and the vibrancy of those colours. So one of my favourite moments within this drawing was working with the spring green in this section here. It blended so beautifully with the blues to create this stunning turquoise tone. It's one of those combinations that just feels really lovely to create as you layer it on, and seeing those cheerful summery colours come through, it just really brought the drawing to life, and I just couldn't help but love how it turned out. Anyway, we're coming to the end of this piece now, and it's time for the final polish and once over. This is where I take a really good look at the entire drawing and decide where I can make any necessary adjustments, whether that's refining the values or boosting the vibrancy of the colours, or just tweaking little details to bring everything together. In the full Patreon class, I walk you through exactly how I approach this process, how I evaluate those values and decide where adjustments are needed. It's such a crucial step, and it really does tie everything together. One thing I always do at the very end, especially with a piece like this that has high contrast shadows, is I take my sharp black polychromase pencil and I add in those really tight, precise nuggets of black back into the deepest shadows. This is especially important in areas like under the feathers or where they overlap in those tiny little corners. It's just a subtle touch, but it really does give the drawing that extra oomph and just makes the contrast pop, adding a little bit more depth to the overall feeling of the piece. So I think that is just about it. I really hope you've enjoyed seeing this piece come to life. I had so much fun drawing this macaw, and honestly I think I've cut the bug for drawing more, so let me know in the comments what bird you like to see me draw next, and I will see what I can do. And as I mentioned earlier, you can check out the full 10-hour class on Patreon if you want the real-time version, where I explain everything step by step, nothing sped up or skipped. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon in another video. Take care and farewell.